He vowed he would never mark me, treating our sacred bond like a curse. Now, he's searching every room of the pack house, desperate for a scent that has already faded. He chose his ego over our instinct, and now he has to sleep in the bed he made, alone. I found out I was getting married from my mother, over the phone, the way you'd tell someone the plumber was coming on Tuesday. The choice have agreed, she said. Jailnim's father wants the ceremony within the month. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, staring at a pot of water that had just started to boil, and thinking how strange it was that the whole shape of my life could change in the time it took noodles to cook. I didn't ask if I loved him. I didn't ask if he loved me. I already knew the answer to both, and I already knew it didn't matter. The morning of the wedding, my hands wouldn't stop shaking as my aunt pinned the last fold of my hanbok into place. She kept clicking her tongue at me, like my nerves were an inconvenience to her sewing. "You're lucky," she said. "Do you know how many omegas would kill for the Choi name?" I wanted to tell her that a name isn't the same thing as being wanted. But I just nodded, because my throat had gone too tight to argue. I saw Choi Jail properly for the first time at the altar, and my chest did something humiliating. It lifted just slightly at the sight of him. He was beautiful in the specific, severe way alphas from old families always are, like his features had been arranged by committee. But it was his eyes that undid me. Dark, sharp, and completely, utterly empty when they landed on mine. He didn't smile. He didn't do anything. He just looked at me the way you'd look at paperwork you hadn't finished reading yet. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself a lot of things that day. The reception blurred into flashing cameras and relatives I'd never met congratulating me on my good fortune. Jail stood beside me for every photo, his hand resting at the small of my back like it belonged there, and every time his fingers pressed a fraction closer, my heart would stutter stupidly, hopefully, like it hadn't gotten the memo that hope wasn't part of this arrangement. By the time we were finally alone, standing in the bedroom of a house I didn't recognize as mine, the mask he'd worn all day for the cameras had already come off. "Let's be clear about something," he said. He hadn't even taken off his jacket yet. He said it the way you'd read out terms of a contract. Flat, efficient, already bored of the conversation. "This marriage happened because my father is dying and needed the merger settled before the board smelled weakness. It has nothing to do with you." "I know," I said. My voice came out smaller than I wanted. "Then you'll understand when I say I won't be marking you." His jaw tightened, just barely, like the sentence cost him something to say. "I won't be touching you at all if I can help it. The moment my father no longer needs this, the moment the board stops watching, this ends. Do you understand?" I understood. I understood in the way you understand a slap before you feel the sting of it. "I understand," I said. He looked at me for a long moment then, longer than he needed to, for someone who just told me he wanted nothing from me. His gaze dropped, briefly, to my throat, to the bare, unmarked skin there, and something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't name. Then it was gone, like a door closing. "Good," he said, and walked out to the balcony, leaving me alone in a bedroom built for two people who would apparently never be one thing to each other. I stood there for a long time after he left. I remember unbuttoning the ceremonial jacket with hands that wouldn't quite cooperate, folding it over the back of a chair because some old habit in me still wanted everything to look neat, presentable, worthy of the house I'd been placed in. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone. "You're lucky." I thought about the way his hand had felt at my back during the photographs, warm, solid, real, and how it meant nothing at all, how it had probably meant nothing to him even as it was happening. I unpacked my single suitcase into the closet on what I already understood to be my side of the room, though there was nothing yet to suggest there was a his side that would ever meet it. I hung up shirts I'd chosen carefully, thinking foolishly about what he might like, and then felt embarrassed at myself for the thought. Outside, I could hear him on the balcony, the quiet click of a lighter, the low exhale of smoke into the night air. He didn't come back in. I climbed into the bed alone, on my side, leaving more space than necessary between the pillow beside me and my own, as if his absence needed room to be official. I lay there a long time listening to the city outside, cars, distant laughter, someone's music through a thin wall, and told myself this was simply what a marriage like mine would look like. Room shared. Name shared. Nothing else. I didn't cry. I want that on record even now. I didn't cry that first night. I just lay very still, staring at the ceiling of a house that wasn't mine, married to a man who had already told me, in his own careful, deliberate way, exactly how little I would ever mean to him. I had no way of knowing yet how much worse it would get before I finally stopped waiting for it to get better. By the second week, I had learned the shape of his absence better than the shape of him. I learned that he left the house at 6:40 every morning, that he took his coffee black with no sugar, and that he hated when the household staff spoke to him before he'd had his first cup. I learned all of this not because he told me, but because I watched, quietly, the way you learn the habits of a stranger you're desperate to understand. I told myself I was just trying to make things easier. That was the lie I fed myself every morning I got up before dawn to have his coffee ready before he came downstairs. The staff had clearly been given some kind of instruction about me, though no one ever said it outright. I noticed it in small things. The way Auntie Park, who ran the kitchen, would answer my questions politely but never warmly, like she'd been told not to get attached to something temporary. I noticed it when Jael introduced me to his father's business partner at the door, and simply said, "This is the arrangement my father mentioned," instead of my name. The arrangement. Not Sunwoo. Not even my husband. Just a word for a problem that had been solved. I smiled anyway. I always smiled anyway. It had become something like armor. One night, about 10 days in, I found him at the kitchen counter at nearly midnight, his sleeves rolled up, a tumbler of something amber in front of him that he hadn't touched. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen from him yet, not the sharp, composed tiredness of a man who'd had a long day, but something heavier, something that sat in his shoulders like a weight he was used to carrying alone. I almost turned around and left. But then I noticed the cuff of his shirt, torn at the seam, hanging loose against his wrist. "You'll ruin that shirt if you don't fix it soon," I said, before I could stop myself. He looked up at me like he'd forgotten I lived there. "I can buy another shirt," he said. "That's not the point." I was already crossing the kitchen before I'd decided to. Sit still. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the quiet or the late hour, or the particular exhaustion in his face that made him look, for just a moment, like someone I might have wanted to take care of under different circumstances. I found the sewing kit in the drawer where I'd unpacked it my first week, and I knelt slightly at his side, taking his wrist gently in my hand to steady it. His skin was warm. Warmer than I expected. My fingers brushed his pulse point as I turned his hand, and I felt it jump, quick, sudden, beneath my touch. Neither of us said anything. I could feel him watching me as I worked the needle through the fabric, and the silence between us had a texture to it I hadn't felt before. Not the cold, careful silence of strangers, but something closer, something that made my own pulse climb into my throat. His breath was slow and even beside me, but I noticed his other hand had curled slightly against the counter, like he was resisting the urge to move it somewhere else. "There," I said, finally, tying off the thread. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. "It's fixed." He didn't pull his hand away right away. For one long, suspended second, his fingers shifted beneath mine. Not quite a grip, not quite nothing, and I felt my whole body go still, waiting, hoping, my heart slamming so hard I was sure he could hear it in the silence of the kitchen. His eyes met mine, dark and unreadable, but there, for the first time since the wedding, there was something in them. Something that looked almost like hunger, quickly swallowed. Then his jaw tightened, and he pulled his hand back like my touch had burned him. "Don't do that," he said. My chest tightened painfully. "Do what?" "Fix your shirt." "Playhouse." His voice had gone cold again, the warmth from a moment ago sealed shut like it had never existed. "I don't need you fussing over me like we're something we're not." I sat back on my heels, the needle still loose between my fingers, and felt something small and hopeful in me curl up and go quiet. "I wasn't trying to be something we're not," I said. "I was just fixing a shirt." "Then fix it and go to bed." He stood, taking the tumbler with him, though he still hadn't drunk from it. At the doorway he paused, just for a second, just long enough that I almost thought he might say something else. Something that would undo the last 30 seconds. Instead, he said, "You don't have to wait up for me. I don't want you to. I don't want you to." I sat alone in the kitchen a long time after he left, staring at the amber liquid still sitting untouched on the counter, and thought about the way his pulse had jumped under my fingers, the way his eyes had looked at me like I was something dangerous. He didn't want me to wait up. But some foolish, stubborn part of me, the part that still hadn't learned its lesson, decided I would anyway. I should have known something was wrong the moment Auntie Park told me to prepare dinner for 6 instead of 4. "Young master's request," she said, not meeting my eyes, which was how I'd learned to recognize when something was going to hurt me before anyone bothered to explain why. I didn't ask who the extra guests were. I already had a slow, sinking feeling settling in my stomach, the kind that comes before you're told something you've already guessed. I spent the afternoon in the kitchen anyway, because it was easier than sitting with the feeling. I made the braised short ribs the way my mother taught me, the way that took hours of quiet, careful attention, and told myself that if I couldn't be wanted in that house, I could at least be useful in it. Useful was something. Useful was more than I'd been given credit for. Jael's parents arrived first, his father moving slower than the last time I'd seen him, leaning slightly on his cane in a way that made something in my chest ache despite everything. Then Jael walked in, and beside him, her hand tucked easily into the crook of his arm like it had always belonged there, was a woman I'd never met. She was beautiful in the specific, unbothered way of someone who had never once had to earn her place in a room. "This is Ariam," Jael said, to his parents, not to me. "An old friend." I stood near the doorway to the kitchen, wiping my hands on my apron, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would place me somewhere in that sentence. He didn't. His mother glanced at me once, quickly, the way you'd glance at a piece of furniture that had been moved slightly out of place, and then looked away. I set the table myself. I served the meal myself. And I sat through dinner watching Choi Jael hold Min Ariam's hand on top of the table, in full view of his parents, in full view of me, like it cost him nothing at all. "You cooked all this?" his father asked me at one point, gesturing at the short ribs, the only kind thing said to me all evening. "Yes, a B&M," I said. "It's good," he said, and went back to his food, and that was the whole conversation. I held on to it anyway, because it was the only thing anyone had given me that night. Ariam laughed at something Jael said, a low, easy laugh, the kind that comes from actually knowing someone, and I watched him smile back at her, a real smile, the kind I hadn't once seen directed at me in the 6 weeks since our wedding. My chest went tight and hollow at the same time, like something had been scooped out of it and left to echo. I don't remember much of what was said after that. I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, too loud, too fast, and the effort it took to keep my face still, to keep pouring water into glasses like my hands weren't trembling. His parents left a little after 10. Ariam left not long after, though not before Jael walked her to the door himself, and I wasn't trying to hear it, but the house was quiet and their voices carried the low, familiar murmur of goodbye that people use when they've said goodbye like that 100 times before. I was clearing the table when he came back inside. "You didn't have to serve everything yourself," he said. Not an apology. Not close to one. "Someone had to," I said. I didn't look up from the plates. He was quiet for a moment and I thought, foolishly, again always foolishly, that maybe this was the part where he said something to soften the evening. Instead, he leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and said, in a voice with no more weight to it than if he were commenting on the weather, "At least Ariam wanted me for something other than a merger." I froze with a plate still in my hands. "I didn't ask for the merger either," I said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But you got the benefit of it, didn't you? The house. The name. The comfort." His eyes flicked over me, cool and assessing, like he was cataloging exactly how little I'd earned any of it. "Ariam never wanted anything from me except me. That's not something you'd understand." I set the plate down very carefully, because I did not trust my hands not to shake if I held it any longer. "No," I said. "I suppose I wouldn't." He left the room without another word, and I stood there a long time in the wreckage of a dinner I'd cooked with my own hands, listening to his footsteps fade up the stairs. I didn't cry that night either. I want that on record too. I just stood very still at the sink, letting the water run hot over my hands until they went numb, and felt something shift inside me, not breaking, not yet, but hardening quietly into something colder than hope. I got caught in the rain 3 streets from the house, and by the time I made it through the door, I was shivering hard enough that my teeth ached. I told myself it was nothing. I'd been running myself thin for weeks, overseeing the house, managing my own quiet grief, sleeping badly in a bed that never stopped feeling like someone else's, and by the time I peeled off my wet clothes and climbed under the blankets, my whole body felt like it belonged to someone underwater. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember waking to the door opening, to a hand pressing against my forehead, cool against skin that felt like it was burning from the inside. "You're an idiot," Jael said, but his voice didn't have its usual edge. It was quieter. "Careful." "I'm fine," I managed, though the words came out slurred and unconvincing even to my own ears. He didn't argue. He just left and came back a few minutes later with a basin of water and a cloth, and sat on the edge of the bed like it was the most natural thing in the world, wringing out the cloth and pressing it gently against my neck, my wrists, the places where the fever burned hottest. I watched him through half-closed eyes, too weak to hide how much his hands undid me. There was something in his face I hadn't seen before, not tenderness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something careful and unguarded in the low lamplight, like he'd forgotten to keep his usual distance because he assumed I was too feverish to notice. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered. Not a question really. More like disbelief, spoken aloud. "Because if you die in this house, it becomes my problem," he said. But his hand had gone still against my jaw, and he didn't pull it away. We stayed like that a long time. Him tending to me in silence, me too tired and too grateful to question it, and somewhere in the space of that silence, something in me that had been guarded for weeks quietly came undone. Later, when the fever had eased and the rain outside had softened to a steady patter against the window, he moved to leave. And I, stupid, hopeful, starved for something I'd convinced myself I didn't need, reached out and caught his wrist. He went still. "Stay," I said. My voice barely a breath. "Please." For a moment, he didn't move. His eyes found mine in the dim light, and something in them cracked open, want, plain and unguarded, the same hunger I'd glimpsed once before over a torn shirt cuff, except this time he didn't look away from it. His hand came up slowly to my jaw, and when he leaned down, I felt the warmth of his breath against my mouth before his lips even touched mine. It was soft. Devastatingly soft, for a man who'd spent 2 months making sure I understood exactly how little I meant to him. My fingers curled into his shirt, and for one long, suspended moment, I let myself believe that maybe this was the version of him no one else got to see. His hand had just found the curve of my waist, his mouth trailing lower, unhurried, like he had all night to memorize me, when his phone rang. He didn't move to answer it at first. But it rang again, insistent, and something in his face shifted, the softness draining out of it in real time, like watching a light switch off. He pulled back and reached for the phone on the nightstand. I saw the name on the screen before he turned it away from me. "Ariam." "I have to take this," he said, already sitting up, already smoothing the front of his shirt like he needed to physically put himself back together. I lay there, my whole body still humming from his hands, and listened to him step into the hallway, his voice low and warm in a way it had never once been with me. When he came back, whatever had cracked open in him minutes earlier had sealed shut completely. "Ariam's coming by," he said, not looking at me. "Make up the guest room. You won't be needing me tonight." The words landed like a hand around my throat. "I see," I said, because there was nothing else left to say that wouldn't break me open in front of him. He left the room without looking back. I heard him downstairs a while later, the door, her laugh, low voices drifting up through the floor, and I lay in the guest room he'd sent me to, staring at the ceiling, my body still aching faintly with the memory of his hands, my chest aching with something far worse. I didn't sleep. I listened, instead, to the muffled sound of them in the next room, and understood, finally, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in how cold it was, that whatever had happened between us that night had meant everything to me and nothing at all to him. By morning, something in me had gone quiet in a way it had never been before. Not broken. Not yet. Just finished waiting. I called Professor Han on a Tuesday, from the far end of the garden where no one could hear me. She had taught my textile design courses years ago, back before my mother decided university was a waste of time for an Omega who was going to be married off eventually anyway. I hadn't spoken to her in 3 years. I still remembered her number. Sunwia, she said, surprised, warm. It's been so long. Is everything all right? I almost lost my nerve right there. I need a favor, I said instead. Do you still know people at that atelier in Daegu? The one that took on apprentices. There was a pause on the line. Not suspicion, just the careful pause of someone doing quick math. You're leaving him. It wasn't a question, but I answered it like one anyway. I'm leaving, I said. Not him. Just this. There's a difference to you? There has to be, I said. Or I don't think I can do it. She didn't ask why. She'd always been the kind of teacher who understood that some questions weren't hers to ask. There's a studio, she said instead. Small. Underpaid. They'd take you in a heartbeat if I asked. Can you be ready in 3 weeks? I can be ready sooner, I said and meant it. After that, I moved carefully, the way you defuse something that could still hurt you if you rushed. I didn't pack a bag all at once. A packed bag could be found, questioned, undone. Instead I mailed things ahead in small increments. A box of books to Professor Han's address, my grandmother's sewing shears wrapped in a scarf, the folder of design sketches I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet since before the wedding, sketches I'd never once shown Jael because some part of me had known, even then, that showing him anything real about myself would only give him one more thing to be indifferent to. I sold the jewelry his mother had given me at the wedding, not out of spite, just practicality, and a certain grim satisfaction in turning what was meant to be a leash into bus fare. The strange part was how normal I made myself act while I did it. I still made his coffee in the mornings. I still asked Auntie Park what she needed from the market. I still sat, some nights, at the far end of the dinner table while Jael scrolled through his phone and didn't speak to me, and some small, tired part of me almost wanted him to notice something was different. He never did. He'd stopped looking at me closely enough to notice anything at all. The night I chose was the night of his company's quarterly close, a night I knew, because I still kept track of things I probably shouldn't have, that he'd be taking Ariam out to celebrate. I heard him on the phone with her that afternoon, his voice easy in a way it never was with me. I'll pick you up at 8, he said, passing me in the hallway without so much as a glance. Wear the blue one. You know I like it. I stood very still until he'd gone into his study and shut the door, and then I went to finish the last of my packing. At 7, he came downstairs in a suit I'd once, foolishly, told him looked good on him. He paused at the door, keys in hand, and glanced at me where I sat on the stairs. Don't wait up, he said. The same words from months ago. The same careless cruelty, worn smooth now from overuse. I won't, I said, and something in my voice must have carried further than I meant it to, because he actually looked at me, really looked, for the first time in weeks. You're being strange, he said. I'm tired, I said. That's all. He studied me a moment longer, something almost like uncertainty flickering behind his eyes, and for one terrible second I thought he might ask something real. Instead he just said, "There's food in the fridge if you want it," and walked out the door. I listened to his car pull out of the driveway until the sound faded completely. Then I got to work. I stripped the bed first, every sheet, every pillowcase, replacing them with a fresh, unworn set from the closet so there'd be no trace of me left in the fabric. I went through the bathroom and removed anything that carried my scent. The soap I used, the small bottle of oil I rubbed into my hands at night, even the towel I favored. I left his side of everything untouched, exactly as it had always been, because I wanted the wrongness to be specific. I wanted him to understand precisely what was missing, not just that something was. I made the bed with a precision that would have made my aunt proud, corners tucked, pillows perfectly aligned, cold and untouched, like no one had ever slept there at all. At the door, I set down my key on the entry table, next to nothing, no note, no explanation, because I'd learned by then that explanations were a kindness he'd never once extended to me. I looked back once at the house that had never once felt like mine, and then I walked out into the dark to meet the taxi already waiting 3 streets down, exactly where I'd told it to be. I didn't cry on the way to the station. I watched the city lights blur past the window and felt, for the first time in almost a year, something that might have been the beginning of peace. Daegu smelled different than Seoul, cleaner somehow, cut through with river air and the faint sweetness of fabric dye from the atelier 2 streets from my new apartment. I woke that first morning to sunlight instead of silence, and for a long moment I just lay there, letting myself feel the strangeness of a bed that was entirely only mine. My phone had 31 missed calls by 9 a.m. I didn't need to look at the name to know whose they were. I made tea instead. My hands were steady in a way I almost didn't recognize. No trembling, no bracing myself for a door to open, no listening for footsteps that weren't coming. I sat at my small table by the window and watched the city wake up, and let the phone buzz itself quiet against the counter. He called again that evening. I almost didn't answer. I don't fully know even now why I did. "Where are you?" His voice came out rough, stripped of its usual composure, like he'd been saying my name into empty rooms all day and this was the first time it had actually reached anyone. "Somewhere you don't need to know," I said. "Sunwoo." My name in his mouth used to undo me. Now it just sounded like a word. "The house, your side of the closet is empty. The bathroom. Everything of yours is just gone. What is this?" "I would think it's obvious," I said. "You didn't leave a note." His voice cracked slightly on the word note, and some old, tired part of me almost softened at the sound of it before I remembered exactly how little my own tears had ever mattered to him. "You never once asked what I needed," I said. "Why would you need me to explain what I'm giving you?" There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, unsteady, and somewhere underneath it, the particular quiet of a house that had never once felt warm to me even when it was full of people. "My father is asking questions," he said finally. "The board is asking questions." "Ariam," he stopped himself. "That's not my problem anymore," I said, and I was surprised by how true it felt saying it out loud. "You're my husband," he said, like the word itself was a claim he'd suddenly remembered he had. "I was a contract," I said. "You made that very clear from the very first night. I'm just finally agreeing with you." He didn't have an answer for that. I let the silence sit there a moment longer, and then I ended the call before he could fill it with something that might have made me doubt myself. He called every day for 2 weeks. Then every few days. Then, eventually, not at all, though by then I'd already stopped flinching at the sound of my phone. I heard the rest of it secondhand, the way you hear about weather in a city you no longer live in. Professor Han mentioned, gently, over lunch one afternoon, that there'd been some scandal in Seoul, the Choi heir's marriage collapsing quietly, no formal divorce filed yet but the household staff talking, his father furious about the timing, about the optics, about a scandal breaking right as the merger needed everyone looking stable. She didn't ask if I wanted to know more. I didn't ask her to tell me. Later, much later, I heard, from a cousin who still moved in those circles, that Ariam had ended things with him not long after I left. That she'd wanted, finally, the thing I'd once wanted too, to be chosen plainly, without a contract standing between them. That she'd looked at jail reaching for a bond he'd spent a year insisting he didn't want, and understood, faster than I ever had, exactly what that meant about the ceiling on anything he could offer her. I didn't feel triumphant hearing it. I want that on record. I just felt something settle, quietly, into place. A door closing somewhere far away, in a life that no longer had anything to do with mine. My new life took shape slowly, the way good things often do. The atelier was small and cramped and paid barely enough to live on, but the first time my design director looked at one of my sketches and said, without hesitation, "This is good, Sunwoo, this is really good," I felt something bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with anyone's hands on my skin, anyone's voice in a hallway, anyone's approval I'd spent a year starving for. I found a small apartment with a window that caught the morning light. I started signing my own name to my own work for the first time in my life. Not the arrangement, not the choice omega, just Baek Sunwoo, the way it had been before anyone decided that name needed to be attached to someone else's to matter. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the warmth of his hand once pressed to my jaw, the softness in his voice the one night he let himself want something out loud. I let myself feel it when it comes. I don't punish myself for missing a version of him that only existed for a few hours, once, before a phone rang and put him back together into the man who preferred me gone. But I don't wait for that version to come find me. I know now he never will, and more importantly, I no longer need him to. I am not waiting for a Mark that will never come. I stopped waiting the morning I left him a cold, empty bed, and for the first time in my life, the silence I walked into felt like mine.